The summer heat in London was unbearable that Tuesday afternoon. Tourists crowded around Buckingham Palace, their cameras clicking constantly as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the famous royal guards. Among the sea of visitors stood Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old construction worker from Ohio who had saved for 3 years to afford this trip to England. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stared at the motionless guard standing at attention. The man looked like a statue, dressed in his iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat. His face showed no emotion, his eyes fixed straight ahead, completely ignoring the hundreds of people surrounding him. How do they do it? Marcus wondered aloud to his travel companion, Jenny, a bubbly college student he had met at the hostel. Standing there for hours without moving a muscle. It's like they're not even human. Jenny giggled as she snapped another photo. I heard they train for months to ignore everything around them. Tourists try all sorts of crazy things to make them react, but they never do. Marcus had always been fascinated by discipline and dedication. Growing up in a small town where most people gave up on their dreams, he admired anyone who could commit to something so completely. His own father had abandoned the family when Marcus was 12, leaving behind only empty promises and unpaid bills. Since then, Marcus had struggled to trust anyone or believe in unwavering commitment. As he watched the guard, Marcus noticed something others seemed to miss. Despite the man's stone-like appearance, there were tiny signs of humanity. A barely visible bead of sweat rolling down his temple, the slight tension in his jaw that suggested he was concentrating hard to maintain his composure, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. The crowd around them grew larger and more restless. Children were crying from the heat, parents were arguing about where to go next, and teenagers were making increasingly bold attempts to get the guard's attention. Someone threw a paper airplane that bounced off the guard's hat. Another person tried to take a selfie while pretending to kiss the guard's cheek. Through it all, the guard remained perfectly still. Marcus found himself studying the man's face more closely. There was something familiar about his features, though he couldn't place what it was. The guard appeared to be around his own age, with strong cheekbones and a determined set to his mouth. His eyes, though focused ahead, seemed intelligent and thoughtful. I wonder what he's thinking about, Marcus murmured. Probably nothing, Jenny replied, already losing interest. They probably trained them to empty their minds or something. Come on, let's go see the changing of the guard ceremony. But Marcus couldn't move. He felt drawn to this silent sentinel, this man who had dedicated himself so completely to his duty. In a world where people constantly sought attention and validation through social media and loud behavior, here was someone who found strength in silence and stillness. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Marcus noticed that the guard's face was becoming flushed. The man had been standing there for over an hour without any relief. Other tourists seemed oblivious to the guard's discomfort, too focused on their photos and videos to consider that there was a real person inside that uniform. Marcus pulled out his water bottle and took a long drink. The cool liquid felt amazing against his parched throat. He looked at the guard again and realized the man must be desperately thirsty. The thick wool uniform and heavy hat would make the heat even more unbearable. That's got to be torture, Marcus said to himself. A family from Germany pushed past him, their children running around excitedly while their parents argued in heated German about the best angle for their photos. One of the children, a boy of about 8, deliberately dropped his ice cream cone near the guard's feet and waited to see if the man would react. When nothing happened, the boy grew bolder, making faces and silly gestures. Marcus felt a surge of irritation. These people saw the guard as entertainment, not as a human being doing an incredibly difficult job. The man was suffering in silence while tourists treated him like a living statue at an amusement park. The heat continued to intensify, and Marcus could see that the guard was struggling. His face had grown pale despite the flush from the heat, and there was a slight tremor in his hands that only someone watching carefully would notice. Marcus had worked construction in extreme weather and recognized the early signs of heat exhaustion. He looked around for any other guards or officials who might provide relief, but saw none nearby. The ceremony wasn't scheduled to change for another hour, and Marcus worried that the guard might collapse before then. Jenny tugged at his arm. Seriously, let's go. There's nothing happening here. But Marcus couldn't leave. Something deep inside him, perhaps the same instinct that had driven him to become the reliable one in his family, after his father left, told him that this man needed help. The guard's commitment to his duty was admirable, but it shouldn't come at the cost of his health. Marcus unscrewed the cap of his water bottle and held it in his hand, feeling its cool weight. He knew that interfering with a royal guard was probably against the rules, but watching another human being suffer while he did nothing felt wrong. The crowd pressed closer, and someone accidentally bumped into Marcus, causing a few drops of water to splash from his bottle onto the ground. The guard's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly toward the sound, so quickly that most people would have missed it. In that split second, Marcus saw something that changed everything. Behind the guard's professional mask, he glimpsed a moment of pure human vulnerability. The man wasn't just hot and thirsty, he was struggling with something deeper, something that went beyond physical discomfort. Marcus made a decision that would alter both their lives forever. Without thinking about the consequences, Marcus stepped forward and gently splashed a small amount of cool water onto the guard's face. The liquid hit the man's flushed cheek and ran down in tiny rivulets, providing instant relief from the scorching heat. The reaction was immediate and shocking. Instead of maintaining his stoic composure, the guard's entire body began to tremble. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and tears started streaming down his face, mixing with the water Marcus had splashed. The crowd around them fell silent, stunned by this unexpected display of emotion from someone they had assumed was incapable of feeling. Marcus froze, his water bottle still in his hand, horrified by what he had done. He had expected to be arrested or at least scolded by security. Instead, he was witnessing the complete breakdown of a man who had been trained to show no emotion under any circumstances. The guard's name was James Mitchell, though none of the tourists knew this. 26 years old, he had joined the Queen's Guard 3 years earlier after struggling to find direction in his life. The military structure and discipline had given him purpose, and he took immense pride in serving his country with honor and distinction. But today was different. Today marked exactly 1 year since James had received the phone call that changed everything. His younger sister Sarah, the only family member who had truly understood him, had died in a car accident. She had been driving to surprise him with a visit, bringing homemade cookies and the latest photos of her newborn daughter. James had been on duty that day too, standing guard just as he was now. When his commanding officer had quietly informed him of the tragedy, James had been forced to complete his shift before he could even begin to process his grief. The military had given him leave for the funeral, but he had never truly allowed himself to mourn. For an entire year, James had buried his pain beneath layers of discipline and duty. He had convinced himself that staying strong and focused was what Sarah would have wanted. She had always been so proud of his service, bragging to her friends about her brother who guarded royalty. The cool water on his face triggered something deep within him. Perhaps it was the unexpected kindness from a stranger. Or maybe it was simply that his body and mind had reached their breaking point. Whatever the cause, all the grief he had been suppressing came flooding out in an unstoppable wave. Marcus watched in horror and confusion as the guard continued to cry. The man's entire body was shaking now, and he seemed to be fighting an internal battle between his training and his emotions. Other tourists began pulling out their phones to record the unprecedented scene, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Stop filming," Marcus shouted at them, his protective instincts kicking in.
"Can't you see he's in pain?"
But the crowd was too fascinated to listen. Videos were already being uploaded to social media with captions like, "Royal Guard has meltdown in tourist breaks. Buckingham Palace Guard." The incident was becoming viral and real. James was aware of the cameras and the growing crowd, which only made his distress worse. He had violated the most fundamental rule of his position: never break character no matter what happens. His career was likely over, his reputation destroyed, all because he couldn't control his emotions when faced with a simple act of human kindness. Through his tears, James looked directly at Marcus for the first time. The American tourist's face showed genuine concern and regret. There was something in Marcus's eyes that reminded James of his sister, the same compassionate warmth that had made Sarah so special. Marcus couldn't bear to see the guard's anguish any longer. Ignoring the phones and cameras surrounding them, he stepped even closer and spoke in a low, gentle voice. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "I didn't mean to cause you trouble. I just thought you looked like you needed help." James tried to speak but couldn't form words. His training told him to ignore the tourist completely, to somehow regain his composure and resume his post. But his heart was breaking all over again, and the genuine concern in Marcus's voice made it impossible to shut down his emotions. Security guards finally appeared, pushing through the crowd with stern expressions. Marcus prepared to be arrested, but to his surprise, they seemed more concerned about the guard's welfare than punishing him for the water incident. "Mitchell, you need to step down," one of the security officers said quietly. "We'll get someone to cover your post." James shook his head frantically. Leaving his post early would be the final nail in the coffin of his military career. Despite his emotional breakdown, he was desperate to complete his duty. "Please," he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "Just give me a moment." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Marcus found himself forming a protective barrier between the guard and the most aggressive photographers. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew that this man needed space and privacy, not spectacle. An older woman in the crowd suddenly spoke up with a crisp British accent. "You should all be ashamed of yourselves, treating this young man's distress as entertainment. He's served his country with honor, and this is how you repay him." Her words had an immediate effect. Several people lowered their phones, looking embarrassed. Others began to step back, giving the guard more breathing room. Marcus looked at the woman gratefully, then turned back to James. The guard's tears had slowed, but his face was still pale and drawn. There was something profoundly sad in his eyes that went far beyond embarrassment about his public breakdown. "Is there someone I can call for you?" Marcus asked softly. "Family? Friends?" James's face crumpled at the word family. The fresh wave of grief hit him like a physical blow, and he doubled over slightly, struggling to breathe. In that moment, Marcus understood that this wasn't just about heat exhaustion or professional embarrassment. This man was carrying a burden of pain that had nothing to do with standing guard in the summer sun. The water had simply been the catalyst that released emotions that had been trapped for far too long. The security officers exchanged worried glances. They had seen guards faint from heat, break protocol under pressure, even lose their temper with difficult tourists. But they had never seen anything like this raw, devastating display of grief. The senior security officer, a weathered man named Captain Davies who had served in the military for over 20 years, recognized something familiar in James's breakdown. He had seen that particular type of grief before, the kind that soldiers carried when they lost someone precious while duty kept them from properly mourning. "Mitchell, that's an order," Captain Davies said firmly but kindly. "You're relieved of duty. Report to my office in 1 hour." James knew there was no arguing with a direct order. His legs felt weak as he prepared to leave his post, something he had never done before the end of his assigned shift. The shame of his public breakdown mixed with his grief, creating a cocktail of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him again. Marcus watched as another guard quickly took James's position, sliding seamlessly into the role as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that would ripple far beyond this single moment at Buckingham Palace. As James began to walk away, his movements stiff and uncertain, Marcus made another impulsive decision. He had already interfered once, and the consequences of that action were still unfolding. But he couldn't let this hurting man disappear without at least trying to help. "Wait," Marcus called out, following James. "Please, just wait a second." James stopped but didn't turn around. His shoulders were rigid with tension, and Marcus could see that he was fighting to regain some semblance of composure. "I don't know what's going on with you," Marcus said quietly, "but I know what it's like to carry pain alone. If you need someone to talk to, someone who doesn't know your whole story or have expectations about how you should handle things, I'm here." For a long moment, James remained motionless. The offer of help from a complete stranger felt both absurd and desperately needed. His fellow guards were his brothers in arms, but they were also part of the same system that demanded perfection and emotional control. His commanding officers cared about his welfare, but they also had to consider military discipline and public image. This American tourist, however, had no agenda beyond simple human compassion. He had already seen James at his most vulnerable, so there was nothing left to hide or protect. James finally turned around, his face streaked with dried tears and flushed from heat and emotion. Up close, Marcus could see that the guard was younger than he had first appeared, with kind eyes that were currently filled with exhaustion and pain. "You shouldn't have done that," James said, his voice hoarse. interfering with a guard on duty. You could have been arrested, Marcus shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do at the time. You looked like you were about to collapse. I've stood longer shifts in worse conditions, James replied. But there was no real conviction in his words. They both knew that this breakdown had nothing to do with physical endurance. Jenny appeared at Marcus's side, having finally caught up with him through the dispersing crowd. She looked confused and slightly annoyed at being dragged into what seemed like a complicated situation. Marcus, what's going on? We're supposed to meet the tour group in 20 minutes. Marcus glanced at her, then back at James. He could see that the guard was struggling with whether to accept help from a stranger or retreat into the privacy of military protocol. You go ahead, Marcus told Jenny. I'll catch up later. Jenny stared at him in disbelief. You're going to skip the Westminster Abbey tour for this? We planned this whole trip around seeing the historical sites. Some things are more important than tourist attractions, Marcus replied quietly. James was moved by this gesture. A stranger was willing to abandon his vacation plans to help someone he had never met before. It was the kind of selfless kindness that Sarah had always shown to others, the quality Marcus admired most about his sister. You don't understand, James said to Marcus. I'm probably going to be disciplined for what happened. Maybe even discharged. You splashing that water might have ended my career. Instead of apologizing again, Marcus studied James's face carefully. Is that really what you're most worried about right now? Your career? The question caught James off guard. He realized that while he was concerned about professional consequences, the deeper pain had nothing to do with military service. The water had simply unlocked grief that had been poisoning him for a year. No, James admitted quietly. No, it's not. Captain Davies approached them, having observed their conversation from a distance. As an experienced officer, he could read people well, and he sensed that whatever was happening between the American tourist and his guard might actually be beneficial. Mitchell, he said, you're officially off duty for the rest of today. Use the time wisely. And you? He looked at Marcus. I assume you're the one who started all this? Marcus nodded, preparing for consequences. Normally I'd have you banned from the palace grounds, Captain Davies continued, but it's clear that you meant no harm. However, I need to know, are you planning to exploit this situation? Sell your story to the tabloids? Post about it online? The question hadn't even occurred to Marcus. No, sir. I just wanted to help. Captain Davies studied him for a moment, then nodded. See that you don't. This young man's private struggles don't need to become public entertainment. Jenny tugged at Marcus's sleeve again. I really think we should go. This isn't our business, but Marcus had made his choice. He looked at James, who was clearly battling internal demons that went far beyond military protocol. There's a quiet cafe about 2 blocks from here, Marcus said. No tourists, no cameras. If you want to talk, or even just sit somewhere cool for a while, the offer stands. James looked between Marcus, Captain Davies, and the dispersing crowd of tourists. His entire world had changed in the space of 5 minutes. Everything he had built his identity around, discipline, emotional control, unwavering duty, had crumbled the moment that cool water touched his face. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe it was time to finally deal with the grief that had been eating him alive from the inside. Okay, James said quietly, but just for a little while. I still have to report to the captain's office later. Marcus smiled for the first time since the incident began. That's all I'm asking for. The small cafe that Marcus had mentioned turned out to be a hidden gem tucked away on a quiet side street. The owner, an elderly Pakistani man named Hassan, had been serving tea and simple meals to locals for over 30 years. The interior was cool and dimly lit, with mismatched furniture that somehow created a welcoming atmosphere rather than appearing shabby. James felt strange walking through London in his full guard uniform without being on official duty. People stared as they passed, some recognizing him as one of the famous palace guards, others simply curious about the elaborate red tunic and towering bearskin hat. He kept his eyes forward, still struggling to process what had happened. Marcus guided them to a corner table far from the windows, offering James some privacy from curious onlookers. Hassan approached with a warm smile, seemingly unfazed by having a uniformed royal guard in his establishment. Gentlemen, welcome to my cafe. What can I bring you on this hot afternoon? 2 cold drinks, please, Marcus said. Whatever you recommend. Hassan nodded and returned shortly with tall glasses of iced mint tea, condensation beading on the sides. James accepted his gratefully, drinking deeply before setting the glass down with shaking hands. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Marcus sensed that James needed time to collect himself, while James struggled with where to even begin explaining what had happened. He had never discussed his personal life with anyone outside his immediate family and closest military friends. "I need to ask you something," James finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me?" "You don't know me. You could have just walked away like everyone else." Marcus considered the question carefully. "I guess because I know what it's like to feel alone with your pain. When I was younger, my father left our family. Just packed up one day and disappeared. My mother fell apart. My little brother was too young to understand. And suddenly I was responsible for keeping everyone together." He paused, surprised by his own willingness to share such personal information with a stranger. "I spent years angry at him for abandoning us," Marcus continued. "But I was also angry at all the people who saw what we were going through and did nothing. Neighbors, teachers, family, friends. They all knew we were struggling, but everyone was too busy or too uncomfortable to get involved." James listened intently, recognizing something familiar in Marcus's story. The weight of responsibility, the isolation that came with trying to be strong for others. "I promised myself that if I ever saw someone else struggling, really struggling, I wouldn't just walk away," Marcus concluded. "So when I saw you standing there, obviously suffering, I couldn't ignore it." The explanation made sense to James, but it also raised questions. "How did you know I was suffering? Everyone else saw a guard doing his job." Marcus smiled slightly. "My little brother used to hide his feelings the same way you do. He thought if he stood perfectly still and didn't make any noise, the pain would just go away. But I learned to read the signs, the tension in his jaw, the way he held his breath, the look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Your brother, is he okay now?" "Yeah, he's doing great, studying engineering at university. But it took time, and it took people who cared enough to not give up on him." James felt a flutter of something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. If Marcus's brother had overcome his struggles, maybe there was a path forward for James as well. "Can I tell you something?" James asked suddenly. "Something I've never told anyone?" Marcus nodded, settling back in his chair to listen. James took a deep breath and began to speak about Sarah. He told Marcus about his sister's laugh, how she used to send him care packages when he was stationed away from home, and how proud she had been when he joined the Queen's Guard. He described the last conversation they had shared just 2 days before her death, when she had excitedly told him about her plans to visit with her baby daughter. "She was driving to surprise me," James said, his voice breaking. "If I hadn't been stationed at the palace that weekend, if I had been somewhere she could reach by train or bus, she'd still be alive." Marcus understood immediately. "You blame yourself for her accident." "I know it's not logical," James replied. "The other driver ran a red light. It wasn't anyone's fault except his, but I can't stop thinking that if I had been available, if she hadn't felt the need to make that long drive." "She made that trip because she loved you," Marcus said gently, "not because you forced her to. She chose to come see you because spending time with her brother made her happy." James had heard similar words from the grief counselor the military had assigned him, from his commanding officers, even from Sarah's husband. But somehow, hearing it from Marcus, someone who had no obligation to comfort him, no professional duty to help him heal, made the words feel more real. "The worst part," James continued, "is that I never got to say goodbye. I was on duty when it happened, and by the time I got leave to travel home, the funeral arrangements were already made. Her husband was dealing with his own grief and a newborn baby. Everyone kept telling me how strong I was being, how proud Sarah would be of my composure." Marcus could see where this was heading. "But you never got to fall apart. You never got to grieve properly." "Exactly. And today when you splashed that water on my face, it was such a simple act of kindness. Someone actually seeing that I was struggling and caring enough to help. It reminded me so much of Sarah, of how she always noticed when people needed help." The emotion threatened to overwhelm James again, but this time, he didn't fight it as hard. In the safety of the quiet cafe with a stranger who had already seen him at his worst, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss. Marcus reached across the table and briefly squeezed James's shoulder. The gesture was simple but profound. Human connection without judgment or expectation. "What happens now?" James asked. "With your military service, I mean," James sighed. "I don't know. Breaking down in public like that, it's probably grounds for disciplinary action. Maybe not discharge, but definitely some kind of consequence. And how do you feel about that?" The question surprised James. He realized that he wasn't as devastated by the potential career consequences as he should have been. The rigid structure that had once given his life meaning now felt more like a prison that prevented him from processing his emotions in a healthy way. "Honestly, part of me might be relieved," he admitted. "I love serving my country, but this past year has been torture. Pretending to be fine when I'm falling apart inside. Maintaining that perfect image when all I want to do is scream." Marcus nodded, understanding. "Maybe this breakdown was exactly what you needed. Maybe it's time to find a new way to serve, one that doesn't require you to sacrifice your humanity." 2 hours later, James walked into Captain Davies' office feeling different than he had in months. The conversation with Marcus had lifted a weight from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For the first time since Sarah's death, he had spoken openly about his grief without feeling like he was betraying his duty as a soldier. Captain Davies looked up from his paperwork as James entered. The older man's expression was unreadable, but his tone was gentler than James had expected. "Sit down, Mitchell. We need to discuss what happened today." James took the chair across from the captain's desk, his uniform still pristine despite the emotional turmoil of the afternoon. He had always taken pride in his appearance, and old habits died hard even in the face of potential disciplinary action. "First," Captain Davies said, "I want you to know that I've been in contact with the Palace press office. The incident has already appeared on social media, but we're working to minimize the spread of the videos. Most of the posts are being taken down at our request." James felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. He hadn't considered how his breakdown might affect the reputation of the Queen's Guard as a whole. "I'm sorry, sir," James began, but Captain Davies held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish. Second, I've reviewed your service record. 3 years of exemplary duty. Never late, never complained. Consistently rated as one of our most reliable guards. Your peers respect you. Your superiors trust you, and until today, you've been exactly the kind of soldier we hope to develop." James waited for the but that he knew was coming. "However," Captain Davies continued, "what happened today tells me that we failed you in some way. A good soldier doesn't break down like that without cause, and from what I observed, your distress went far beyond heat exhaustion or embarrassment." The captain leaned back in his chair, studying James with the experienced eye of someone who had mentored countless young soldiers over the years. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want an honest answer. Are you fit for duty right now, in your current mental and emotional state?" James had been prepared for many possible questions, but not this one. The military culture he had grown up in didn't encourage self-reflection or admission of weakness. Soldiers were expected to push through pain, both physical and emotional, without complaint. But his conversation with Marcus had shown him the cost of that approach. Suppressing his grief hadn't made him stronger. It had made him brittle, ready to shatter at the first unexpected kindness. "No, sir," James said quietly. "I don't think I am." Captain Davies nodded, apparently unsurprised by the answer. "Can you tell me why?" James took a deep breath and began to share the story he had told Marcus, though in more formal language appropriate for a military setting. He explained about Sarah's death, his inability to properly grieve, and the mounting pressure of maintaining his composure while falling apart inside. Captain Davies listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly just giving James his full attention. When James finished, the office fell silent for several long moments. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" the captain finally asked. "Or seek help from military counseling services?" "I thought I could handle it on my own," James replied honestly. "I didn't want to appear weak or unreliable. The Guard has a reputation to maintain, and I didn't want to be seen as someone who couldn't handle the pressures of service." Captain Davies shook his head. "Mitchell, asking for help when you need it isn't weakness. It's intelligence. A good soldier knows his limitations and takes action to address them before they become a problem for his unit." The captain opened a file drawer and pulled out several forms. "I'm placing you on administrative leave for 2 weeks, effective immediately. During that time, You'll undergo a full psychological evaluation and begin regular counseling sessions with a grief specialist. James felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The time off would give him space to heal, but he worried about the long-term implications for his career. "What happens after the 2 weeks?" he asked. "That depends on you," Captain Davies replied. "If the evaluation shows that you're ready to return to duty, we'll discuss options for getting you back on rotation. If you need more time, we'll extend the leave. And if you decide that military service is no longer the right path for you, we'll help you transition to civilian life with honor." The last option surprised James. He had expected punishment, not support for a potential career change. "Sir, I need to ask, am I in trouble for what happened today?" Captain Davies considered the question carefully. "Officially, you broke protocol by displaying emotion while on duty. However, given the circumstances and your previously exemplary record, I'm treating this as a medical issue rather than a disciplinary one. There will be a note in your file, but it won't affect your ability to serve if you choose to return." Relief flooded through James. His career wasn't over, and he had options for moving forward. "There's something else," Captain Davies added. "The American tourist who splashed water on you, Marcus Thompson. He waited outside the palace gates for over an hour hoping to hear that you were okay. My security team eventually told him you were fine and suggested he continue with his vacation, but he left his contact information in case you wanted to reach out." James was moved by this gesture. Marcus had already given up part of his vacation to sit with a stranger in crisis, and now he had waited even longer to ensure that his intervention hadn't caused lasting harm. "I'd like to thank him," James said. "What he did today, it might have saved my life." Captain Davies raised an eyebrow. "Saved your life? That seems dramatic," James shook his head. "Not dramatic at all, sir. I've been carrying this pain for a year, and it was getting worse every day. I'd started having thoughts about what it would be like if I just stopped. Today was the first time in months that someone showed me genuine human kindness without expecting anything in return. It reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people worth living for." The captain's expression grew serious. Suicidal ideation among military personnel was a constant concern, and he realized how close they might have come to losing a good soldier to preventable tragedy. "In that case," Captain Davies said, "I think reaching out to Mr. Thompson might be an excellent idea. Sometimes the people who help us heal come from the most unexpected places." James stood up, feeling lighter than he had in months. The road ahead would be difficult. Grief counseling, psychological evaluation, major decisions about his future. But for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt hope that healing was possible. "Thank you, sir, for understanding, for giving me options, for not giving up on me." Captain Davies smiled slightly. "The military is only as strong as the people who serve in it, Mitchell. Taking care of our soldiers isn't just good policy, it's the right thing to do." 3 days later, Marcus was sitting in his hotel room reviewing photos from his London trip when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the country code indicated it was a UK caller. "Hello?" Marcus answered cautiously. "Is this Marcus Thompson?" The voice was distinctly British, formal but warm. "Yes, it is. This is James Mitchell. We met at Buckingham Palace a few days ago. You helped me when I was having a difficult moment." Marcus immediately recognized the voice, though James sounded much calmer and more composed than during their cafe conversation. "James, I was hoping you'd call. How are you doing?" "Better, actually. Much better than I have in a long time. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did, and to let you know that everything worked out okay with my commanding officer." Relief flooded through Marcus. He had spent the past 3 days worrying that his impulsive act of kindness had destroyed James's military career. "I'm so glad to hear that. I've been kicking myself for interfering without thinking about the consequences for you." "Don't," James said firmly. "What you did was exactly what I needed, even though I didn't realize it at the time. You gave me permission to be human again." Marcus found himself smiling as he listened to the change in James's voice. There was still sadness there, but also something that hadn't been present during their first meeting. Hope. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Are you going back to guard duty?" "I'm on leave for the next 2 weeks for counseling and evaluation. After that, I'll decide whether to return to the Queen's Guard or pursue something different. Honestly, I'm not sure yet, but for the first time in a year, I feel like I have real choices." There was a pause before James continued. "I was wondering, are you still in London?" I know you're on vacation, but I'd like to buy you dinner if you're free. A proper thank you. Marcus checked his itinerary. His original plan had been to leave for Scotland the next day, but something told him this was more important than sticking to a rigid schedule. I'm free tonight, Marcus said, but only if you promise to let me pay. You don't owe me anything. James laughed, and the sound was genuinely happy. We'll fight about the bill when we get there. Do you like Indian food? I know a place that's much better than tourist restaurants. That evening, Marcus found himself in a small Indian restaurant in Camden, sitting across from James, who looked dramatically different out of uniform. Dressed in casual clothes, the former guard appeared younger and more relaxed. The rigid military posture was gone, replaced by the natural movements of someone who was learning to be comfortable in his own skin again. You clean up nice without the bearskin hat, Marcus joked as they looked over the menu. James grinned. You have no idea how heavy that thing is. Wearing it in summer heat is like having a fur blanket wrapped around your head. They ordered their food and settled into easy conversation. Marcus was surprised by how much he enjoyed James's company. The British man was intelligent and funny, with a dry sense of humor that emerged once he relaxed. They discovered shared interests in history, sports, and surprisingly, cooking. So what do you do back in Ohio? James asked as they waited for their main courses. Construction, mostly commercial buildings. It's good work, honest work, but not exactly glamorous. Do you enjoy it? Marcus considered the question. I'm good at it, and it pays the bills. But lately I've been thinking about whether there's something else I'd rather be doing. Like what? This is going to sound crazy, Marcus said, but I've always thought about teaching. Maybe working with kids who are going through tough times like I did when my father left. James nodded thoughtfully. That doesn't sound crazy at all. You have a natural instinct for helping people. You proved that with me. What about you? If you don't go back to the Guard, what would you want to do? James was quiet for a moment, stirring his tea as he thought. Before I joined the military, I wanted to be a paramedic. I liked the idea of being the person who shows up when people need help most. The Guard gave me structure and purpose after Sarah died, but it also required me to suppress the very qualities that drew me to helping professions in the first place. Maybe it's time to revisit that dream, Marcus suggested. Maybe it is. As the evening progressed, their conversation grew deeper. James talked more about Sarah, sharing happy memories instead of focusing solely on his grief. Marcus opened up about his struggles with trust and commitment issues stemming from his father's abandonment. You know what's strange? James said as they finished their dessert. I feel like I've known you much longer than 3 days. There's something about you that feels familiar, like talking to an old friend. Marcus felt the same way. Despite their different backgrounds and the unusual circumstances of their meeting, there was an easy connection between them that he had rarely experienced with anyone. Maybe it's because we both know what it's like to carry burdens alone, Marcus suggested. We recognize something in each other. James nodded. Sarah used to say that the most meaningful relationships in life often begin with one person helping another through a difficult moment. She believed that shared vulnerability creates stronger bonds than shared interests or circumstances. Your sister sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. I think she would have liked you. The comment moved Marcus more than he expected. He had never met Sarah, but through James's stories he felt like he had come to know and respect her. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, James hesitated. I know you're supposed to leave for Scotland tomorrow, but would you consider extending your stay in London for a few more days? I start counseling sessions next week, and I think it would help to have a friend around for support. The request surprised Marcus. He barely knew James, and staying would mean completely rearranging his travel plans. But something about the way James asked, hopeful but not desperate, grateful but not presumptuous, made the decision easy. I can change my flights, Marcus said. Scotland isn't going anywhere. James's smile was radiant. Thank you. I know it's a lot to ask of someone you just met. Actually, Marcus said, I think we stopped being strangers the moment I splashed water on your face. Everything since then has just been getting to know each other. They walked out of the restaurant together into the cool London evening. Two men whose lives had been forever changed by a simple act of human kindness on a hot summer day. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the arrivals hall of Heathrow Airport scanning the crowd for a familiar face. His hands were slightly nervous as he checked his phone for the 3rd time, even though he knew James's flight from Manchester had landed on schedule. Then he spotted him. James looked healthier than Marcus had ever seen him, his face fuller and his posture more relaxed. He was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a Manchester University sweatshirt, and carried a single backpack. When their eyes met across the busy terminal, James's face broke into a huge grin. "You made it," James called out as he approached, pulling Marcus into a warm embrace that would have been unthinkable during their first meeting. "Of course I made it," Marcus replied, stepping back to look at his friend. "I wouldn't miss your graduation from paramedic training." The past 6 months had brought remarkable changes for both men. James had ultimately decided not to return to the Queen's Guard, choosing instead to pursue his old dream of becoming a paramedic. The transition hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, financial stress, and the challenge of starting over in a new field at 26. But with the support of therapy, his military savings, and encouragement from Marcus across the Atlantic, James had persevered. Marcus had undergone his own transformation. Inspired by his experience helping James, he had enrolled in evening education courses back in Ohio, working toward a teaching certificate while continuing his construction job during the day. It was exhausting, but for the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt like he was moving toward something meaningful rather than just getting by. "How was the flight?" James asked as they walked toward the exit. "Long, but worth it. I can't believe you're actually graduating tomorrow. A year ago, you were standing guard at Buckingham Palace." James shook his head in amazement. "It feels like a lifetime ago. Sometimes I can barely remember what it felt like to stand there for hours, trying not to feel anything." They had maintained regular contact since Marcus's extended stay in London the previous summer. What had started as check-in calls to ensure James was adjusting well to therapy had evolved into a genuine friendship built on shared experiences and mutual support. They texted frequently, had weekly video calls, and had even coordinated visits when James had training rotations in different cities. "Speaking of remembering," James said as they climbed into a taxi, "I have something to show you when we get to my flat." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" Not worried, but definitely surprised. James's new apartment was a small but comfortable space near the hospital, where he had completed his training. It was a far cry from the strict military housing he had lived in for years, decorated with personal touches that reflected his growing comfort with civilian life. "Sit down," James said, disappearing into his bedroom. He returned carrying a framed photograph and a thick scrapbook. The photograph showed James in his new paramedic uniform, standing next to an ambulance with his training class. His smile was genuine and proud, completely different from the stoic expression he had worn as a royal guard. "Congratulations," Marcus said, studying the photo. "You look happy. I am happy. Happier than I've been in years. But that's not what I wanted to show you." James opened the scrapbook and flipped to a specific page. It contained printouts of news articles, social media posts, and forum discussions, all related to the incident at Buckingham Palace 6 months earlier. "I've been collecting these," James explained. "Stories about what happened that day, but more importantly, responses from people who saw the video or heard about it." Marcus looked confused. "Why would you want to keep reminders of that?" James turned to another page filled with comments and messages. "Read some of these." Marcus scanned the collection. There were messages from military families talking about hidden struggles with grief and PTSD. Tourists shared stories of witnessing the incident and being moved by Marcus's compassion. Several posts came from people who had been inspired to seek help for their own mental health challenges after seeing James's breakdown and recovery. "This one is my favorite," James said, pointing to a longer message. It's from a woman in Australia whose brother was a veteran struggling with depression. She said that seeing our story, specifically seeing a stranger step up to help someone in crisis, gave her the courage to intervene when her brother was having suicidal thoughts. She credits our story with saving his life. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had never considered that their encounter might have ripple effects beyond their own lives. "There are dozens of similar messages," James continued. People who sought therapy, reached out to estranged family members, or simply started paying more attention to the struggles of those around them. What happened to us that day, it changed more than just our lives. Marcus sat back, overwhelmed by the unexpected impact of what he had considered a simple, impulsive act of kindness. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked quietly. Splashing that water on me, I mean. Getting involved in a stranger's crisis? Marcus thought about the question seriously. The past 6 months had certainly been complicated. Changing his travel plans, maintaining a long-distance friendship, rearranging his own life goals to accommodate new priorities inspired by his experience with James. But regret? Never, Marcus said firmly. That moment changed my life too, you know. Meeting you, seeing how you fought to rebuild yourself, it showed me what real strength looks like. It inspired me to take risks with my own future. James smiled. Sarah would have loved this story. She always believed that helping others was the key to healing yourself. They spent the rest of the evening talking about their plans for the future. James had accepted a position with the London Ambulance Service, starting the week after graduation. Marcus was halfway through his teaching certification and had applied for positions working with at-risk youth. You know, James said as they prepared for bed. I've been thinking about something. What would have happened if you had just walked past that day? If you had seen me struggling and decided it wasn't your problem? Marcus considered this. I honestly don't know. Maybe you would have made it through your shift and dealt with everything privately. Maybe things would have worked out differently. I don't think so, James said quietly. I was in a very dark place, darker than I let on even to you. I'm not sure I would have made it much longer without some kind of intervention. The weight of this revelation settled over both men. They were quiet for several minutes, contemplating the random nature of human connection and the profound impact that small acts of compassion could have. Tomorrow, James said, when I walk across that stage to receive my paramedic certification, I want you to know that you'll be part of that achievement. You saved my life, Marcus. Not just that day at the palace, but every day since when you encouraged me to keep going. Marcus felt tears in his eyes. And you saved mine too. You showed me what it means to turn pain into purpose, to use your struggles to help others. The next morning, Marcus sat in the audience at James's graduation ceremony, watching his friend accept his certification with pride and joy. As James walked across the stage, Marcus thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A splash of water on a hot summer day had connected two strangers and changed the trajectory of both their lives. After the ceremony, James found Marcus in the crowd. Ready to celebrate? Absolutely, Marcus replied. But first I have something for you. He handed James a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple water bottle with an engraving, for the moments when kindness matters most. James laughed, holding up the bottle. Perfect. I'll carry this with me on every call, as a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures have the biggest impact. As they walked out of the graduation hall together, Marcus realized that their friendship had become one of the most important relationships in his life. What had started as a moment of crisis had evolved into something beautiful and lasting. You know what I think? Marcus said as they stepped into the London sunshine. What's that? I think your sister was right. The most meaningful relationships do begin with one person helping another through a difficult moment, but the real magic happens in everything that comes after. James nodded, looking up at the sky with a peaceful expression. She would have been so proud of both of us today. And in that moment, both men knew that their story was far from over. It was in many ways just beginning.